stop scrolling right now. Because what I'm about to explain is not just another headline, not just another opinion, and definitely not another internet rumor. It's a real policy decision that quietly went into effect, and it has the potential to decide whether your wealth slowly disappears in the coming years or quietly survives one of the most chaotic economic periods of our lifetime. Right now, the world is entering a trade war unlike anything we've seen before. Prices are rising, supply chains are breaking, governments are panicking. And while the mainstream media keeps your attention locked on tariffs for cars, smartphones, electronics, and everyday consumer goods, something far more important slipped through without noise, without debate, and without public awareness. An executive order was signed, a modification was added, and buried inside that legal language was a massive exemption, one that changed the entire game for precious metals, especially silver. This is not hype. This is not speculation. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is about a decision made at the highest level of government that quietly acknowledged something most people are never taught. Real money is treated differently. And if you don't understand what just happened, you could miss one of the most important wealth preservation shifts of this decade. By the end of this video, you're going to understand why silver was protected, why almost everything else was hit with tariffs, what this means for prices, inflation, and manufacturing, and most importantly, what it means for you, whether you own silver or not. So buckle up, because this is not a surface level story. This is a deep dive into a policy decision that most people notice until MIS too late. To understand why this matters, you need to understand the chaos that was unleashed first. When the current administration entered office, it didn't move slowly. Within hours, executive orders began flying out. Directives were sent to cabinet members, trade practices were reviewed, reports were demanded, and the foundation was laid for a complete restructuring of how the United States interacts with the global economy. Then came the hammer. Using the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the administration declared a national emergency tied to trade deficits. That declaration unlocked sweeping authority, and with that authority came what they called reciprocal tariffs. This wasn't a minor adjustment. This wasn't symbolic. This was a structural shock. A baseline tariff of 10% was imposed on imports from nearly every country. Then came the escalations. Certain nations were hit with 20%, 30%, and in some cases, tariffs exceeding 100%. China saw tariff rates spike dramatically before temporary reductions. The European Union bounced between aggressive rates depending on negotiations. Canada and Mexico were hit with tariffs tied to border security and drug enforcement. The justification was national security. The argument was simple. Decades of trade deficits, unfair practices, and one-sided agreements had created an extraordinary threat to America's economic stability. Whether you agree with that logic or not is irrelevant. The orders were signed, the tariffs went live, and global trade erupted into chaos. Countries retaliated, supply chains scrambled, manufacturers panicked. Prices began shifting almost immediately. Steel and aluminum were hit with 25% tariffs. Automobiles and auto parts came under fire. Copper was investigated. Pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, lumber, all suddenly vulnerable. It felt like nothing was safe. Everything imported into the United States was about to become more expensive, or so everyone thought, because hidden inside the executive orders, and more importantly, inside their modifications, was something extraordinary. An exemption list. And on that list was something that immediately caught the attention of people who understand money at a deeper level. Bullion. Let me say that again. Bullion. According to the official White House fact sheet, certain goods were moved into a protected classification, meaning they would no longer be subject to reciprocal tariffs. These goods included bullion-related articles. In trade terminology, bullion includes gold, silver, platinum, and palladium in forms like coins, bars, and ingots. Gold's exemption was explicit and unmistakable. Silver's inclusion, while less loudly advertised, was unmistakable to industry experts. The National Coin and Bullion Association immediately confirmed it. Precious metals remained tariff-free. And this is where most people stop thinking. They assume this was a favor. They assume this was generosity. They assume this was about investors. That's wrong. The administration didn't exempt silver because it wanted to help silver investors. It exempted silver because it had no choice. The United States does not produce enough silver to meet its own demand, not even close. Silver is not just an investment metal. It is a critical industrial input. Solar panels, electronics, medical devices, batteries, water purification systems, military hardware, advanced technology. If tariffs had been applied to silver imports, industrial costs would have exploded overnight. Manufacturers would have been crushed. Prices would have surged, and the policy would have defeated itself. You can't protect domestic production of something you don't produce enough of, so silver was protected. But here's the part almost nobody understands. This exemption was not just an economic decision, it was a statement. By placing precious metals in a protected category, Exempt from trade wars, exempt from tariffs, exempt from chaos, the government implicitly acknowledged something profound. Bullion is different. It is not just another commodity. It is not just another import. It is not just another line item. It is money. And that single recognition triggered a chain reaction that most investors still haven't noticed. Because when uncertainty disappears, markets react. And when markets react quietly, opportunity appears before headlines catch up. This is where the real story begins. Now that you understand why silver was exempt, we need to talk about what happened after that exemption became real. Because this is where most people completely lose the plot. Markets don't move on headlines. Markets move on structure. And when a government quietly changes the structure of trade, capital starts repositioning long before the public notices. The moment the bullion exemption was confirmed, something subtle but extremely important happened inside the precious metals market. Dealers, wholesalers, refiners, and institutional buyers recalculated risk. Uncertainty vanished, and when uncertainty disappears, pricing behavior changes immediately. For platinum and palladium, dealer premiums collapsed almost overnight. Why? Because the fear of future tariff costs evaporated. No tariffs meant no surprise expenses. No surprise expenses meant tighter spreads. And tighter spreads mean more liquidity. But silver is not platinum. Silver is not palladium. Silver plays a completely different role in the global economy. Silver lives at the intersection of money and machinery. It is both a monetary metal and one of the most heavily consumed industrial resources on Earth. And that dual identity is exactly what makes this exemption so powerful. Here's where the real leverage kicks in. While raw silver flows into the United States tariff-free, many of the products that contain silver do not. Think about that carefully. Silver itself enters without penalty. But solar panels made overseas, tariffed. Electronics assembled abroad, tariffed. Medical devices manufactured outside the US, possibly tariffed. This creates a distorted but intentional economic incentive. If you are a manufacturer deciding where to build your next factory, the math just changed dramatically. Import silver into the US, no tariff. Manufacture domestically, avoid tariffs on finished goods. Manufacture overseas, get punished at the border. That is not an accident. That is industrial policy disguised as trade enforcement. And it does something extremely important to silver demand. It concentrates it. If manufacturing shifts back toward US soil, even partially, domestic silver consumption rises sharply, not hypothetically, structurally. And here's the problem. Global silver supply is not flexible. Silver production has been relatively flat for years. The largest producers are Mexico, Peru, China, Australia, and Russia. The United States produces silver, but nowhere near enough to satisfy its own industrial appetite. Mining is not software. You can't scale silver production overnight. New mines take years to explore, permit, finance, and build. And many silver mines are actually byproducts of copper, lead, or zinc mining, which means silver supply depends on entirely different market forces. So what happens when demand quietly increases, supply stays constrained, and tariffs block finished goods instead of raw materials? Pressure builds. Not immediately, not explosively, but relentlessly. This is how commodity bull markets actually start. Not with fireworks, but with friction. Now layer inflation on top of this. Tariffs are inflationary by nature. That's not ideology, that's economics. When imported goods cost more, businesses have two choices: absorb the cost and destroy margins. Pass the cost to consumers. Almost always it's option 2. That means higher prices for electronics, vehicles, appliances, building materials, and medical equipment. And inflation does something psychologically powerful. It exposes currency weakness. When people realize their money buys less every year, they instinctively start looking for something that doesn't decay. Historically, that something has been precious metals. Gold gets the headlines, silver gets the flow. Why? Because silver feels accessible, gold feels elite, silver feels attainable. A $2,000 gold ounce scares people. A $25, $30 silver ounce invites them. That psychological difference matters more than most analysts admit. Now, here's where silver becomes uniquely dangerous to ignore. Silver is exempt from the very tariffs causing inflation. Read that again. The asset that historically protects against inflation is explicitly protected from the policies driving inflation. That's not common. That's rare. It means silver doesn't suffer the same cost drag that other commodities do in a tariff-heavy environment. Instead, it benefits indirectly as everything around it becomes more expensive. This creates a relative value shift. Silver doesn't have to skyrocket to win. Everything else just has to get worse. And that's exactly what tariffs do. Now, let's talk about currency, because this is where sophisticated investors start paying very close attention. Trade wars create currency instability. Always have. Always will. Tariffs distort trade balances. Trade distortions affect capital flows. Capital flows move currencies. Sometimes the dollar strengthens, sometimes it weakens, sometimes it whipsaws violently. That uncertainty is toxic for long-term planning. And when currency confidence weakens, investors revert to assets that don't depend on government promises. Silver is priced in dollars, but it does not belong to the dollar. That distinction matters. A dollar is a liability of the government. Silver is an asset with no counterparty risk. That's why during periods of trade conflict, geopolitical tension, and monetary experimentation, precious metals quietly absorb capital. Now, here's the part most people miss entirely. This executive order didn't just exempt silver from tariffs, it implicitly reclassified silver as strategic. At the same time, tariffs were being deployed. The administration launched investigations into critical minerals under national security frameworks. Now let's address the question that almost everyone asks at this point. What if I don't own any silver? Why should I care? This is where the story becomes personal, because even if you never buy a single ounce of silver in your life, this executive order still reaches into your wallet. Silver is not a niche asset sitting in vaults for investors. Silver is everywhere. It is inside the device you're watching this on right now. It's in your phone, your laptop, your television, your car, your appliances, and your home's electrical systems. Every time you touch modern technology, you're touching silver. And here's the uncomfortable reality. Many of the products you rely on are manufactured outside the United States. Those products are now being hit with tariffs ranging from 10% to well over 100%, depending on the country of origin. The silver inside them is tariff-free. The rest of the product is not. That means prices rise anyway. But here's the critical detail. Without the silver exemption, those prices would be rising even faster. The exemption is acting like a pressure valve. It doesn't stop inflation, but it prevents an even worse scenario. Let's start with consumer electronics, because this is where most people feel inflation first. Smartphones, laptops, tablets, gaming consoles, smart home devices, all of them rely on silver for electrical conductivity. Silver is the most conductive metal known to man. That's why it's used in circuit boards, switches, connectors, and solder. Most of these devices are assembled in countries now facing heavy tariffs. So when those products cross the border, they arrive more expensive. Manufacturers don't absorb that cost. Retailers don't absorb that cost. You do. Now imagine if silver itself had also been tariffed. That would have compounded the increase. Instead of prices rising by 10, 20%, they could have risen by 30 to 40% or more. That exemption doesn't make electronics cheap. It makes them less expensive than they otherwise would be, and that distinction matters. Next, let's talk about energy, specifically solar energy. Silver is a critical component in photovoltaic cells. It's used in silver paste that collects and transports electricity within solar panels. As the push toward renewable energy accelerates, silver demand from the solar sector has exploded. Some estimates suggest that solar manufacturing alone could consume close to 20% of global silver supply in the coming years. Now imagine what would have happened if silver imports were tariffed. Solar panel costs would have surged, renewable energy projects would have slowed, electricity costs would have risen, and that affects everyone. Instead, silver remained exempt. That kept one of the most expensive inputs stable. But here's the catch. Many solar panels are still manufactured overseas, particularly in China, so while silver enters tariff-free, finished panels do not. Once again, this creates a strong incentive for domestic manufacturing. Build the panels and the U.S. import silver without tariffs. Avoid penalties on finished goods. This is not theory, it's already happening. And it means something important. Domestic silver demand increases. Now let's talk about healthcare, an area where price increases are not just annoying, but dangerous. Silver has antimicrobial properties. It's used in wound dressings, catheters, surgical tools, coatings, and medical devices. Hospitals depend on silver-based products to prevent infections. If silver had been tariffed, medical supply costs would have jumped. Healthcare providers would have paid more. Insurance costs would have risen. Patients would have absorbed the difference. The exemption prevented that, at least on the raw material side. But again, if those medical devices are manufactured overseas, tariffs still apply to the finished products. This means healthcare inflation doesn't disappear. It just doesn't get worse than it already is. Now think about automobiles. Modern vehicles are rolling computers. Electric vehicles rely even more heavily on silver for power management systems, sensors, and circuitry. As tariffs increase vehicle costs, the exemption on silver helps stabilize one component, but not the entire vehicle. Prices rise anyway. This pattern repeats across the entire economy. Silver acts like a stabilizing input while everything around it becomes more expensive. And that creates an invisible effect. The purchasing power of your money erodes more slowly than it otherwise would, but it still erodes. This is why inflation feels confusing. Prices rise even when governments claim they're under control. Now let's zoom out. Tariffs don't just affect prices, they affect behavior. Companies respond by reshaping supply chains. Governments respond with retaliation. Currencies respond with volatility, and volatility changes how people think about money. When inflation becomes persistent, people stop trusting cash. They look for ways to store value without watching it decay. Historically, this is when precious metals quietly absorb demand, not from speculators, from savers, from retirees trying to protect purchasing power, from families trying to preserve savings, from institutions hedging risk. And here's the key psychological shift. When silver remains exempt from tariffs while everything else becomes more expensive, it becomes relatively more attractive. It doesn't need to promise massive gains. It just needs to avoid punishment. That's enough. Now let's talk about jobs, because this is a major justification for tariffs. The argument has always been about bringing manufacturing back, protecting workers, rebuilding the industrial base. The silver exemption supports this narrative in a very specific way. To understand why silver was exempted, you have to stop thinking like an investor and start thinking like a government. Because governments don't care about charts. They care about leverage. They care about control. They care about dependency. And most of all, they care about what happens when systems are stressed. Right now, the global system is stressed. Supply chains are fractured. Trust between nations is thin. Currencies are under pressure. And trade is no longer just trade. It's a weapon. Tariffs are not economic tools anymore. They are political pressure points. When one country raises tariffs, it's not just about money. It's about forcing behavior. And the United States is doing exactly that. But here's the constraint. You cannot weaponize trade without hurting yourself. Every tariff creates domestic pain, higher prices, inflation, political backlash. So governments must choose where to apply pressure and where to create exemptions. Silver sits precisely at that intersection. Now let's talk about China, because you cannot understand this story without China. China dominates global manufacturing. Electronics, solar panels, medical equipment, automotive components. And China also dominates silver refining. Not mining, refining. Raw silver is extracted all over the world, but much of it passes through China's industrial ecosystem before becoming usable at scale. That creates a problem. If the US tariffs silver, it risks choking its own industrial base. If it doesn't tariff silver, it maintains access, but increases dependency. So why exempt it? Because the US believes it can shift dependency faster than China can replace demand. This is the gamble. Tariff finished goods, exempt raw inputs, force manufacturing relocation. Over time, this weakens China's leverage while strengthening domestic production. But here's the part nobody wants to say out loud. This strategy only works if raw materials remain accessible. And silver is not optional. There is no substitute that performs the same function at scale. Copper conducts electricity, but not as efficiently. Aluminum is cheaper, but inferior. When performance matters, silver wins. That makes silver strategic. And strategic materials do not get treated like consumer goods. They get protected. Now let's talk about currencies, because this is where the story deepens. Tariffs don't exist in a vacuum. They interact with exchange rates. When tariffs rise, global trade slows. When trade slows, currencies fluctuate. And when currencies weaken, inflation accelerates. The US dollar is strong, for now, but strength creates its own problems. A strong dollar hurts exports. It widens trade deficits. It increases global debt pressure. Many countries owe debt denominated in dollars. As the dollar rises, their debt becomes harder to service. This creates instability, and instability forces responses. Central banks print money, they cut rates, they intervene. All of this increases global liquidity. And liquidity eventually finds its way into hard assets. Not immediately, not predictably, but historically, inevitably. Now think about silver's position in this environment. It's priced globally, it trades internationally, it responds to currency shifts, and unlike gold, it's deeply embedded in industrial demand. That dual role is powerful. Gold is a monetary metal. Silver is a monetary and industrial metal. That means silver doesn't just respond to fear, it responds to necessity. Now let's talk about leverage again, but this time from China's perspective. China understands this game. That's why it has been quietly accumulating strategic resources for decades. Rare earths, energy, industrial metals. China knows that supply control equals power, but silver presents a dilemma. If China restricts silver exports, it hurts global manufacturing and including its own. If it floods the market, it suppresses price, but devalues its own holdings. So China walks a tightrope. Meanwhile, the US is using tariffs to shift production without cutting off inputs. That's why the exemption exists. It's not generosity, it's calculation. Now here's where things get dangerous. When multiple nations start using trade as a weapon, the system fragments, alliances weaken, trust erodes, redundancy replaces efficiency. This increases costs everywhere. Globalization was cheap because it was optimized. Deglobalization is expensive because it's defensive. And expensive systems are inflationary by nature. That's the world we're entering, a world where redundancy matters more than speed, where resilience matters more than efficiency. In that world, raw materials become more valuable, not because they are scarce, but because they are essential. Silver fits that definition perfectly. Now let's talk about financial markets, because this is where perception lags reality. Markets are forward-looking, but only within familiar frameworks. They understand earnings, they understand rates, they understand GDP. They struggle with structural change. Tariffs are structural change. Supply chain shifts are structural change. Geopolitical fragmentation is structural change. Markets underprice these transitions. That's why reactions seem delayed. Silver doesn't spike immediately. It grinds, it consolidates, it absorbs pressure until something breaks. And when it breaks, pricing is violent, not because of speculation, but because positioning was wrong. Now let's talk about trust. Money works because people believe it will hold value. When inflation persists, trust erodes. People don't panic at first, they adapt. They cut spending. They downgrade lifestyles. They delay decisions. Eventually, they look for alternatives. This is where physical assets re-enter the conversation. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. Silver doesn't scream safety. It whispers practicality. It's affordable. It's divisible. It's useful. That matters psychologically. Now let's connect everything. Tariffs increase costs. Exemptions signal strategic importance. Silver sits at the intersection of technology, energy, healthcare, and defense. That makes it untouchable, for now. But here's the final twist. Exemptions don't last forever. They exist until conditions change. If domestic production reaches a threshold, if alternative supply chains stabilize, if geopolitical priorities shift, everything I've heard so far eventually comes down to one simple reality. Policy decisions don't stay on paper. They travel slowly and quietly until they land inside your daily life, inside the price of the things you buy, the savings you hold, and the future you're trying to protect. Most people never notice this process while it's happening. They only react when the effects become impossible to ignore, when prices jump, when headlines scream, when everyone suddenly starts talking about the same asset at the same time. By then, the opportunity has already passed. The market has already adjusted. The advantage is gone. That's how it always works. Silver doesn't move first, it moves last. And that's exactly why it matters. People think markets react to news. They don't. They react to positioning. News only explains what already happened. The silver exemption didn't create excitement, and that's the point. It quietly changed the rules while attention was elsewhere. No hype, no panic. Just a subtle shift in how value flows through the system. Silver is not designed to make you rich overnight. Anyone selling that story is selling fantasy. Silver exists for a different reason. It exists to preserve purchasing power when everything around it is losing stability. It exists to absorb pressure when currencies weaken, supply chains fracture, and trust starts to erode. That's why governments treat it differently. That's why it was protected when other materials were punished. That's why it sits at the center of technology, energy, healthcare, and defense all at once. Few assets in the world carry that combination of utility and monetary history. Inflation doesn't arrive as a shock. It arrives as a slow bleed. Prices don't explode overnight. They creep. Salaries lag. Savings lose strength. People adjust without realizing what they're giving up. That's why most people feel poorer years later but can't pinpoint when it happened. Silver doesn't stop inflation. Nothing does. What it does is give you a way to step outside the system that's causing it. The mistake most people make is waiting for certainty. They want confirmation. They want proof. They want headlines to tell them it's time. But certainty only arrives after repricing. By the time everyone agrees silver matters, it's already expensive, scarce, and difficult to access without paying a premium. The smart move is never dramatic. It's boring. It's gradual. It's disciplined. Small allocations, consistent positioning, no emotion, no chasing, no panic, just quiet preparation while the crowd looks elsewhere. Silver's role isn't to outperform everything, it's to balance everything. When markets are calm, it looks useless. When systems are stressed, it becomes obvious why it was there all along. This moment we're living in is not about collapse, it's about transition. A shift away from efficiency toward resilience, away from globalization toward fragmentation, away from trust toward hedging. These transitions are slow, uneven, and uncomfortable. And they reward people who understand structure instead of noise. Trade wars don't end cleanly. Tariffs don't disappear quietly. Exemptions don't last forever. They exist until conditions change. And when they do, markets don't ask permission before repricing. Silver sits patiently through all of this. Not loud enough to attract speculators, not exciting enough to dominate headlines, just useful enough to remain essential, and just scarce enough to matter when pressure builds. History has shown this pattern again and again. Those who position early don't celebrate. They don't boast. They simply protect what they've built while others scramble to understand what went wrong. The question isn't whether silver will matter. It's whether you'll understand why it mattered before everyone else does. Because when the conversation finally shifts, when the media starts explaining what was hiding in plain sight, the window won't be wide anymore. It never is. The policy is already in place. The incentives are already aligned. The demand is already growing. The only thing missing is public attention, and that silence is the signal.